The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar offered by the Florida League of Cities titled, What's on the Legislative Agenda for the 2011 Session? This webinar is designed to provide an overview of critical issues that will affect cities during this upcoming legislative session and review the Florida League of Cities Legislative Action Agenda. Today's presenter is the legislative team for the Florida League of Cities. This session will last 45 minutes with 15 minutes for questions at the end. We are asking that you hold your questions for that time. Please use the Q&A section to submit your questions during that time, or you may submit them to your webinar speaker via their contact information at a later time. Today's webinar presentation will be posted in the FLC website at www.floridaleagueofcities.com under the Events and Training tab following the session. Now we will hear from Scott Dudley, who will lead off.
Good afternoon. This is Scott Dudley with the League of Cities, and I'm in here with the Florida League of Cities legislative team, and we're going to kind of walk you through Florida's political landscape, sort of what's going on in the state of Florida now that we've had the elections, and then we're going to walk through the legislative priorities for the league, and then take your questions. Start off with, of course, the governor. As you know, we have a new governor in the state of Florida, and Governor Rick Scott is largely an unknown commodity in the state in that he is basically relatively new to the state and certainly brand new to politics. He ran on a self-funded campaign, and largely his platform was jobs, 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 getting Florida back to work. And the citizens of the state thought that was the direction we needed to go, and so hence we have a new governor. One of the first actions that the governor did, he issued an executive order dealing with agency rulemaking, and he asked all agency, basically his executive order held up any new rules by agencies, asked them not to be promulgating any new rules in the short run, so that's part of the whole effort that, or the concept that he ran on, is that there was part of the problem with the jobscape in Florida was that we had too many regulations, and so that was one of Governor Scott's first actions. You can see on the screen in front of you, the governor's putting together his team. There's some of the key players in the governor's administration as we know them right now. We have a couple of the agency heads there for your, and these are all available as Sharon indicated. They'll be online. The presentation will be online, so if you need any of these names or any of this information, it's available to you afterwards. Oops, go back to that one, sorry. In addition to a new governor, we have a new cabinet, and just want to point out to you that it's also, everyone on the cabinet is brand new all at once, so the executive business of the state is all going to be handled by new folks too. It's all at once, so it's going to make for some very interesting dynamics. Former State Senator Jeff Atwater is the CFO. Pam Bondi was a state prosecuting attorney down from the Tampa-Hillsborough area, and Anna Putnam, of course, was a former congressman from the Bartow area, and that's the new cabinet. In the House, 41, there's 120 House members. Of that 120 House members, 41 are new. In the Senate, it's a 40-member Senate, and 13 of those are new members. With respect to that, some of the new senators actually served in the House before, so they do have some experience in terms of the legislative process, as do some of the new House members. Some are recycled due to term limits. They sat out a term or two and now are back in, but for the most part, those 41 new House members don't have any legislative experience at all, And so it's going to be a very interesting dynamic from the standpoint of they're going to be learning on the fly, trying to understand the way that the legislature operates, and we'll be trying to help educate them on that. 12 of the 40 senators have local government experience. They've served on school boards or zoning commissions or some type of local government experience. 12 of the senators, and then 42 of the House members have some sort of local government experience. So that actually bodes well for us in that ideally they understand our problems, our issues, and our concerns, and are going to come at things with an approach of home rule and local control. One of the important things is that there's a veto-proof majority in both the House and the Senate. Right now there's a special election being held down in the Miami area to fill the seat of State Senator Frederica Wilson, who won a congressional seat. That seat is open right now, but it's likely going to go Democrat, so the number will be 28 Republicans and 12 Democrats. That is a veto-proof majority, and from a rule standpoint, it changes the dynamics in the Senate in terms of certain procedural efforts require 2/3 votes, and this makeup of the Senate is going to make that a very interesting course in terms of how much say the Democrats actually have in any of the happenings in the Senate. Along those same lines, I will say that in the Senate, typically there's been an old saying that the House proposes and the Senate disposes, and I think that this year in 2011 and 2012 with the new Senate president, I think we're going to see it is a far more conservative Senate than we've seen in the past. I think that we're actually going to have the Senate generating a lot of their own ideas and pushing an agenda more so in the past. Typically the House is because of the makeup, the representation, there's 120 members in the House, so it's supposedly the more representative body, and so you usually got more parochial type of ideas and things going on from the House, and then the Senate would look at things from a broader perspective. But I think that you are going to see a difference this year in terms of the way that the Senate operates. It's going to be very much a lot more ideologically driven and pretty much driven, I think, from a top-down approach. In the House, oops, sorry about that. Briefly show you that the leadership team in the Senate that has been put together. The League has pretty good working relationships with most of these folks, and they've been around for a while. So we will be trying to work with them and make sure that they fully understand our issues in the Florida Senate. A couple more go here to the Florida House. We have 82 Republicans, 38 Democrats, also a veto-proof majority in the House. And again, the dynamics that I talked about with respect to the rules and the operations of the House of Representatives. The Democrats they're not going to have very much say in the way things happen because of the makeup with the sheer number in terms of the Republicans versus the Democrats. The House is also, it's led by Speaker Dean Cannon. It is also decidedly, it's a pretty conservative body also, and there are the leadership team is largely conservative, and the House too is going to be more conservative than usual. Give you some of the key committees. We can talk about some of that. Go back to the Transportation Economic Development Committee, which is one that affects cities a lot. That's Representative Mike Horner out of the Orlando area. State Affairs is a committee that we're going to deal with a whole bunch, and that is Representative Seth McKeel out of the Lakeland area, and we've already been in contact with those folks, and we've given them our agenda, and we're trying to make sure that they too understand fully the League's agenda and the direction that we want to go in. Key issues for the 2011. I'm sure you all have heard that there's some money's kind of tight this year. One of the issues that's making it tight is that there's a huge budget deficit. There's no Florida is reliant largely on tourism dollars, on the documentary stamp tax, and there's not very many houses changing hands right now, so therefore the documentary stamp tax dollars are down significantly. The budget projection, the number goes from $2.6 billion to as high as, I've heard numbers as high as $5 billion. So it just depends on what day and who's doing the prognosticating. So it's quite a big hole that needs to be filled. And part of the problem with that is that in the past few years, although there's been a lot of complaining about the stimulus money, the Florida legislature has certainly used that stimulus money to fill the budget holes, and this year there's not stimulus dollars available, and so it's going to be it's going to be a lot harder this year to try to fill those budget holes. Also, there's been an awful lot of trimming of the fat over the last few years. The Republicans have been in control for the last 12 years, and that they certainly have, as part of their agenda, have focused on trying to trim the waste from state government where they can find it. And so I think that when we talk about trying to cut the budget for this year and for the 2011-2012 sessions, it's going to be very difficult. It's going to get down to some meat and bone. There's not very much fat left on there at all. I think you've heard in the papers that there's going to be a lot of efforts at streamlining, regulatory streamlining, and along that goes with streamlining of agencies. There's been talk of combining DOT, DCA, and DEP, but there's a whole bunch of other talk that other agencies, DCF and ACA, and that's Agency for Healthcare Administration. So lots of talk about combining agencies, trying to find savings where they can by cutting staff and overhead, and I think that that's going to be an interesting exercise. Governor Rick Scott is releasing his budget on February the 7th, and I think that the general consensus is that everyone certainly wants to see the governor succeed in creating the 700,000 jobs that he ran on as a platform, and to cut the state budget. But the legislature has given the governor due deference at this point in terms of saying, let's see what the governor proposes in his budget, and if he has some good ideas in there, I think that the legislature will follow along with some of those ideas and help the governor achieve some of those. Some of the other key issues you've heard probably about the spending caps, revenue and expenditure caps for the state, also known as TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, job creation, jobs, let's get to work, pension reform, and all these issues, or some of these issues we're going to talk about in greater detail, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail right now on them. Pension reform, Medicaid reform. There was a $400 million increase in the Medicaid caseload from last year. Well, the state has to pay for that. In addition, the federal legislation, also known as Obamacare, is supposed to expand the Medicaid rolls, so there's going to be even a greater need for Medicaid dollars, and so that's part of where they're going to try to get a waiver from the federal government to be able to make those dollars that we have go further. You heard me talk some about the regulatory streamlining. That means cutting processes, making permits easier to obtain, make those permits have a longer life, et cetera, et cetera. Transportation funding, key issue there. I think that we're really looking at whether there's going to be high-speed rail in the state of Florida. That's certainly an important issue and one that's going to cost some money. The governor said that, and some legislative leaders have said that they don't want to come up with the $290 million thereabout to fund the high-speed rail initiative, and I think that actually what you're going to see in terms of transportation funding is an effort to sweep some of the state transportation trust fund dollars to put them to other uses, and so that's going to certainly be problematic. Talked about some of this already. Stagnant and reduced property values, the implementation of the class size amendment. That's a big issue. As you know, on the November ballot, there was an effort to change the class size amendment to make it a little more workable. The voters did not pass that, and so Right now we have in the Constitution that class size, there's only can be a certain number of children in each classroom, and that means more bricks and mortar and trying to figure out a way to fulfill that constitutional prerogative. And I think that one thing you're seeing from the governor is that he has talked a lot about expanding school choice, trying to make that go further, and that may be one way that they're going to try to address that class size amendment issue. Briefly, we're going to talk about the overall picture on the legislative priorities, and then each of the legislative team is going to introduce themselves and talk about their issues for you, give a kind of a brief overview and sort of where those issues are. Reclaimed water, primarily that deals with the water management district authority over reclaimed water. Alternative and renewable energy, getting Florida on a path to having sustainable energy policy and an energy policy that can help create jobs so that we can be a part of that let's get Florida to work. Revenue and expenditure caps, that's the Tabor proposal. Police officer and firefighter pensions. Growth management, changes in that in terms of the role of the Department of Community Affairs, should one continue to exist after this, what role they should play in growth management. Unfunded mandates, economic development, how can we create those jobs in the state of Florida and still keep Florida being what people want Florida to be. Insurance coverage for retirees, and effective public notice. And start off with reclaimed water, and I'll continue there. Basically, right now there's an issue with the water management districts wherein that the statute is unclear as to the role of the water management districts with respect to reclaimed water. Reclaimed water is essentially the treated water from the wastewater treatment facilities, and the water management districts are, in our opinion, in the League of Cities and cities around the state, believe that the water management districts are trying to grab control of that resource, and we are trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. We think that utilities should get an allocation for credit for the amount of reclaimed water that they create. Essentially what that means is that right now if you get a consumptive use permit for water use, and a lot of the times when your permit is up for review, the water management districts essentially penalize you for doing a good job of conserving water and using reclaimed water in other ways so that you're not using all the water that's available to you in your consumptive use permit. And so sometimes they'll take some of that water away from you in your consumptive use permit. We think that practice should stop. Alternative renewable energy, briefly, is that Florida, when you look at our state policies, there's a lot of language in statute that talks about encouraging or incentivizing different programs, but there's really not a comprehensive or meaningful statewide energy policy. It's sort of all over the map in terms of what our policy is. There's some inconsistencies in statute that, in one instance tell you that you have to do X, Y, and Z, and then on another page you flip it, another section of statute, and you have to do A, B, C, and there's some inconsistencies in that, and we think that we should get those straightened up, cleared up, and get those statutes more clarified. Renewable energy minimum standard, that is that utilities should be required to purchase a certain amount of their energy from or utilize renewable sources for their energy, be it solar, wind, biomass, whatever that is. Tax incentives for their use of renewable energy, ensuring that cities have the ability to maximize their use of renewable energy in whatever form and fashion that they deem appropriate or necessary. Encouraging transportation-related energy efficiency practices, mass transit, transit-oriented development, and that will go hand in glove with the growth management changes that we see. And then technical assistance for some of the smaller cities so that they can implement some of the state policies and get on board with trying to be a player in the alternative and renewable energy areas. And now We're going to talk some about the revenue and expenditure caps, and Rebecca O'Hara will now talk to you about that.
Good afternoon. I'm sure all of you probably are quite familiar with the past proposals to impose revenue and expenditure caps on both state and local governments, otherwise known as TABOR. We have faced this proposed legislation for several years now, and each year it has failed to pass. This is an important issue to the Senate President, Senator Herodopoulos, and so we have anticipated this being a major focus during the 2011 legislative session. And just to give you an idea of where the issue stands today, we understand from the Senate President that his intention is to roll out a bill in the next couple of weeks that applies to the state only. His intention is to address this at the state level first, to try it out there, and that for his purposes that local government, cities and counties and school districts will not be included in the initial proposal for this year. Now, we don't know if we will be put back in at some point or whether this will be done in a 2-year type of process, but we are expecting to see some legislation made public sometime within the next 1 to 2 weeks, and so stay tuned on that. That bill will originate in the Senate Finance and Tax Committee, and it will have its first hearing in that committee as well. We will be noticing that on our website as soon as we get more information about it. On the House side, it's my understanding that the House is kind of taking a wait-and-see attitude towards what the Senate is going to do on this issue. I think that we won't see much movement on the House side with respect to this issue until it becomes clear what the Senate President's intentions are in this regard. That's kind of what the picture today on this issue looks like. If we were to take a snapshot, things obviously change pretty quickly this time of year, so please stay tuned on this issue by continuing to refer to our website, which, by the way, there should be some additional information for you on the issue of revenue caps that could prove useful in your conversations, not just with legislators, but with other business owners and other people in your community when you're talking to them about this issue in terms of trying to provide some education on the issue. I encourage you to take a look at the League's website to get some information in this regard. As you talk to business groups or constituents or legislators about the issue of revenue and expenditure caps, some of the things that we find useful, obviously the League opposes the idea, but oftentimes it helps to illustrate why. Why is this a bad idea? Why is it not workable? And here's what we propose that you do when you're talking about the issue. Talk about some of the things that are flawed with the proposal. Primarily, what are we talking about? Number one, the proposal as it stood last year didn't include a timeout provision. In other words, if it turned out that things really went south and the proposal wasn't workable for Florida, we would be pretty much stuck with it. It was a constitutional amendment that was proposed. You can't really go back in and fix it if there's anything wrong with it. So we believe that one of the fundamental flaws of the proposal as it stood last year is that there was no provision, there was no safety valve, there was no timeout provision in case the economy continued to go south. So that would be one thing to mention as you talk to people about this. Another issue that's pretty compelling about this is that prior proposals based the inflation indicator on the Consumer Price Index. In other words, it established a baseline year for your revenues and allowed those revenues to only increase by a factor that was related to the Consumer Price Index, which makes sense if governments were in the business of buying milk and cheese, but as you know, governments don't buy milk and cheese typically. We usually buy things like fire trucks and asphalt and cement. Those things are more appropriately tied to what is known as a government price index or a GPI. So one of the things that you can talk to people about is, hey, this thing doesn't even use an index that's appropriate for governments. It's tied to a consumer price index instead of a GPI. The third thing that would be useful to talk about is that it also erroneously assumes that governments have 100% control over their own expenditures, which wholly ignores the fact of life that all levels of government, except for the federal government, have unfunded mandates foisted on them from other governmental entities. This is especially true at the city level, where you get them from two sides. You get them from the feds and you get them from state government. So it's important to mention that this proposal in previous years has not accounted in any respect for unfunded mandates and how that will affect your ability to control your expenditures. Another issue that comes up from time to time as this bill has floated through the legislature in the past is that oftentimes we'll see certain types of government make the case that they ought to be excluded from this type of proposal. It's our position that if this thing applies to local governments, that it ought to apply to all types of local governments. There ought not to be special exceptions made for special districts or for the school districts. If we're all in the barrel, we're all in the barrel and nobody gets out. That's important because what we see happening historically is when ideas like this are proposed, at the end of the day, typically the only people that are left in the barrel are cities and counties. And we want to prevent that from happening. If it's such a great idea, we think it ought to apply to all local governments. Finally, we are urging our folks, you guys, to talk about that the proposal ought to make special accommodation for the different types of revenues and services that cities typically provide. You know, we're a little bit of a different animal. We provide a number of proprietary services. We operate utilities, both electric and water. And because of that, the proposal ought to make accommodation for those types of revenues and expenditures. And there's a whole laundry list of them that are set forth in the League's legislative priority on this issue, and some of them are listed in this outline in front of you. But you can see just by the examples given that, you know what, there are some types of revenues that are typically not really within your control that should be treated in a different way should a TABOR proposal go forward. That's the summary of where we are on TABOR at the moment and a little bit of background for you. Casey Cook is going to, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm skipping. Craig Kahn is going to give you an update on municipal police officer and firefighter pension plan reform.
This has been an issue that the League has been pursuing for at least the last 3 years, and it relates to how our police and fire pension plans are funded and the level of benefits that are required to be given. The policies that are in play this year are, there will be, well, let me start at a little bit higher level. The legislature, both the House and the Senate, recognize that public pensions, the issue of public pensions takes on two distinct areas, one being the Florida retirement system, and very few cities participate in the Florida retirement system, but as a separate and distinct area in need of some action by the state legislature is the area of municipal police and fire pension plans. And fortunately, the House Speaker and the Senate President have recognized that, and they've, as issues and proposals are being heard in the Senate and the House substantive committees, that distinction is being made. So to get down to some of the policy areas that we are pursuing, the first is some type of a restriction on how you determine your average final compensation and your pension determination, and trying to restrict the use of overtime. This is typically referred to as the spiking issue, when you see significant increases with the compensation for your police and fire plans primarily in the last few years. Also, right there at the very highest level is getting up from the requirement to provide extra benefits with additional insurance premium tax revenues, and to offer some type of flexibility in how cities can use insurance premium tax revenues to pay for a current or a reduced level of benefits in their current police or fire plan. That third bullet relating to and that's more flexibility on the ability to use insurance premium tax revenues. Some of the other policy areas, we would like to see some type of opportunities to control primarily the expenses incurred by the operation of boards of trustees, and provide some flexibility again to, if a city wants to go to a different pension system, such as potentially the Florida retirement system, to remove certain hurdles for those cities to convert to the FRS. I'm going to move off of some of the policy issues that the League has adopted and talk again at a little bit higher level. There has been a House bill that has been filed, House Bill 303 by Representative Costello. It was filed around January 20th, and on January 27th, Representative Costello withdrew House Bill 303. And he withdrew it for a number of reasons, but primarily because the House committee that is going to be addressing pension reform, it's the House Subcommittee on Government Operations. That subcommittee and then the full committee, the House State Affairs Committee, have both made it very clear that there will be a committee bill that addresses in the same bill changes to the Florida retirement system and changes to municipal police and fire pension plans. In the Senate, there have been no member bills filed because Senate President Herodopoulos made it abundantly clear that the Senate Governmental Oversight Committee chaired by Representative Ring will be producing a committee bill, again, relating to FRS changes and police and fire changes. From our perspective, that's very good. You know, we are definitely in the mix, but it has been made abundantly clear to us as staff that while the House and Senate leadership is willing to help us to help ourselves, there's an expectation that that municipal officials support the efforts of the legislature to help fix some of the policy issues that that we currently operate our police and fire pension plans under. And so it's very important for us to emphasize to our legislators that we need them to make changes to state law so that we can effectuate changes at the local level to these police and fire pension plans and try to make them more fiscally sustainable. It's a very important message, and it's going to be crucial that our city officials come out in strong support of these efforts and walk hand in hand with our state legislators to accomplish these goals. And with that, I will turn it over to Casey.
Good afternoon. 2010 was a relatively quiet year for growth management legislation. It's worth noting that the Department of Community Affairs wrapped up its sunset review in 2010, and the legislature did not reenact the agency. So DCA is hanging out there kind of in a state of limbo, and the discussion over the last several months is, you know, what's going to happen to the agency and what's the appropriate role of the agency. The Growth Management and Transportation Committee decided that DCA is valuable for Florida cities and that they do a lot of good things. They provide technical assistance for our local governments and help guide them through a very complicated process. They did want to stress that the agency needed to only focus on issues of statewide concern. So we have taken a position that we think DCA should stick around, but that they should only focus on those issues of statewide importance. They just had a new secretary named Billy Bazette, who is a former developer from the St. Joe Company, has now taken over the agency. and it will be interesting to see, his relationship with the legislature. Skipping around a little bit, in 2009, Senate Bill 360 was passed. Several cities filed a lawsuit claiming that Senate Bill 360 violated the single subject clause and was an unfunded mandate for several of our cities. A court has overturned the law, but it remains in effect while it's at the appellate court. The legislature, in response to that, has filed 3 bills, or on the Senate side there are 3 bills, Senate Bill 172, 174, and 176, and basically they've broken up the original Senate Bill 360 into 3 bills to get around any single subject challenges. The other thing that they're doing is they're trying to pass these through quickly, and if they can pass them through with more than a 2/3 majority vote, they get around the unfunded mandates provision. So that's going to be something to watch. We expect that bill to pass early in the session. We have been working with Representative Jeff Clemens to get a bill filed dealing specifically with reporting requirements. Several of our cities found these reporting requirements to be onerous, and they were sucking down valuable resources. Several cities in the state are not growing, have no plans to grow, and are completely built out, and they're spending money to file reports, and they're not really getting much out of it. So we've been working with Representative Clemens to give these cities a reprieve from some of these requirements if they meet certain budget thresholds. Finally, we've seen some proposals dealing with the growth management system and basically overhauling Chapter 163. These will be interesting to watch. We think that it's going to be a big year for growth management, and we're largely supportive of these proposals at the current time. With that, I'll turn it over to Kenny Pratt, who is going to handle some intergovernmental relations issues.
Before we hear from Ken, I'd like to remind today's participants to submit your questions to the Q&A section. I'd also like to remind you that the webinar will be posted on the League's website at www.floridaleagueofcities.com. If you'd like to receive the PowerPoint slides, if you will send that to Rose Hall at the Florida League of Cities at rhall@flcities.com. Now we'll hear from Ken Pratt.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to talk a little bit about a common theme that the League has had, unfunded mandates, which has been our legislative priority for quite a while, and it continues to be. Obviously, with Governor Scott having made the campaign promise to create over 700,000 jobs, unfunded mandates is an important issue as well. We're going to talk about economic development in a minute, but unfunded mandates and making sure that we don't pass, or that the legislature doesn't pass any additional unfunded mandates, has been something that we've been asking the legislature to do for quite some time. And last year we're relatively successful in having them not create any additional new unfunded mandates. So that theme is something that we want to continue to resound in the legislature and have them understand where we're coming from. Also want to, the conversation has really gone to another level when it comes to unfunded mandates, in the sense that now the legislators have begun to ask which unfunded mandates are we talking about and how much money are we talking about. They want to know the details, and so we're trying to equip our members, and we would ask you to ask your finance folks in your different cities to also give you real numbers if they're possible. And if you only have ballpark numbers, that's fine too, but try to specify or try to get a good idea of exactly what those unfunded mandates are, and identify them, and also, if you can, like I said, get a ballpark figure at least, so that you can say these are the top 3 or the top 5 unfunded mandates that are affecting my city, Senator so-and-so, and I'd like you to consider doing something about those. So we want to be as specific as we can with those issues. Obviously, the bottom line here, as you can see in the slide, is that unfunded mandates undermine governmental transparency and accountability, something that's been a very common theme with the legislature lately. Okay, I want to move to economic development now. As I said, with Governor Scott and his 700,000 jobs promise, we have had quite a bit of activity in the economic development area. You may have even heard that recently he fired Enterprise Florida's president and CEO because he knows that this is going to be a very big promise that he has to make good on. And so this is going to be a real focus. And what we have focused on here at the League is making sure that Governor Scott knows that a great deal of that economic development, that prosperity that we want for the state of Florida does come through cities, that it's an important thing to come through cities, and that much of what he wants to achieve can happen through cities, and what we can do for that to help him achieve that goal. One of the things that obviously everyone wants to do is attract new businesses to the state, attract and retain, and also have other folks relocate here. So that's, again, a very key issue, and creating the right environment with the right economic incentives is a very important thing that Governor Scott has looked at doing. Really, when the situation comes down to it, this is going to be probably his most important thing, is what he can bring, or what businesses he can bring to the state of Florida. We also talk about preserving and promoting affordable workforce housing, and that many of you all know the Sadowski Housing Trust Fund has been around for quite some time now, and the legislature has traditionally swept the Housing Trust Fund. We are again asking them this year to not only not sweep the trust fund, but to take off the legislative cap that was imposed several years ago, and to give cities the opportunity to put that money towards what it should go towards, which is affordable housing. And obviously we know that our housing market needs those funds. I want to talk also a bit about some of the other incentives that are out there right now. The leveraging of private investments through state tax credits is a very, very important one. It allows basically the state to give out tax credits, and in return, there is public infrastructure that's built, and obviously that's money that our cities don't have to spend, that goes through private investments. Obviously there's a return for a private investor, but where it really impacts us or really impacts your cities is that it does not require you to put out that money that you normally would have to put out when it comes to public infrastructure. Also encouraging private and public partnerships has been a theme that we've seen, and we want to continue to encourage that, and we believe the governor will continue to encourage that as we look at ways in which, again, the private and the public can come together to really use what we already have. We already have quite a few business areas and quite a few businesses that are empty, and so we want to use what we currently have to use it better, I guess is what I'd say. And then finally, also soliciting additional federal tax credits for environmentally sustainable and affordable housing has been a key thing that we'd like to ask the legislature to do, is to continue to ask for those federal tax credits from the federal government. So with that, I think Craig's going to go back and talk about
the mandates.
Okay.
Next two slides are good examples of mandates that hopefully your city can generate some numbers and share those with your legislators. The first mandate has been in law for quite some time, and that is a requirement that governmental entities provide what I am terming subsidized insurance coverage for retirees. This relates primarily to the health and hospitalization insurance coverages that you are required to offer to your retirees at a below market value a premium for your retirees. And it's very significant. You may have heard the term OPEB, or other post-employment benefit, that you, under your current accounting standards, have to report on your books every year. The next mandate relates to the requirement that cities and counties provide a number of legal ads and notices in newspapers. There have been some very preliminary type numbers generated collectively statewide. Cities have to spend, it's estimated, at least $10 million a year to comply with these notice requirements. Counties likewise have to spend about $10 million a year, and for a to the tune of $20 million of state taxpayer funds going to provide a lot of notices and maps and other advertisements through the newspapers when there are very likely more effective ways to communicate with our constituents at a substantially lesser cost. Again, any numbers that you can generate relative to these types of examples and share them with your legislators would be good information. And with that, I'm going to turn it over for on transportation.
I will be brief because we're running out of time, and I know we have a lot of questions. Transportation comes down to dollars and the lack thereof. There's no DOT secretary yet, so they haven't put out a legislative agenda yet. I know that last week the cutoff, there are now I think 9 or 10 finalists for that secretary position, and hopefully we'll find out who that secretary is going to be within the next week or two. The league took a position that we don't think that the legislature should sweep the Transportation Trust Fund. We think that it provides valuable roads and that we should keep that money and use it for what it was intended to. Finally, red light cameras. We expect there to be a bill. There have been bills filed that would repeal red light camera programs. If you'll remember last year, there was a bill passed by Representative Reagan that allowed cities to operate red light camera programs. There is going to be a bill filed this year that will repeal that law. So that's something to watch. With that being said, I will pass it on to Scott Dudley to wrap things up and answer some questions.
Hello again. I just wanted to talk to you real quick. Hopefully that was helpful and instructive to all of you in understanding a little bit more about our issues. And our issues, of course, are your issues. And we here, the lobbying team, we cannot do what we have to do over at the Capitol without your help. All politics really is local. You help put a local face on these issues for us, and when we don't have that, we don't do very well in terms of being successful with our agenda. But and so we really do implore you to get involved, to help us put a local face on the issues. As there's over 2,000 elected officials in the municipal officials in Florida, and each one of you has a unique story to tell about what your city is doing, and we really want you to tell that story. We send out requests for information and for help on legislation, and we ask, how does this impact you? Sometimes we get back messages like, oh, this is a bad bill. Well, we're pretty much aware sometimes that it is a bad bill. We need more than that. We need specifics from you as to what the bill does and how it actually impacts you. If you look at just the pure numbers with 2,000 elected municipal officials, that gives 12 municipal officials for every legislator. That's a heck of a team to be working on every legislator, and truly we could make a lot of difference over in Tallahassee, over at the Capitol up here in Tallahassee. They talk about being that in real estate it's location, 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 and in politics it's relationships, relationships, relationships. And if you haven't done anything in order to reach out to your local legislator, we encourage you to do that. Invite them to a local one of your budget meetings, or to tour your wastewater treatment plant, or to look at your CRA, or whatever it is that you have going on in your city. Send them what your plan is for the city. Make sure that you're communicating. And it's also important that you don't just reach out to them when you need something, that you're reaching out to them to offer assistance to them too. What can you do for them so that it's a two-way street? Nobody likes a friendship where only one friend is giving, and that's just so it's good that you reach out and do that. And the last primary point I want to make is to use the league as a resource. You heard that there's a lot of expertise in this room, and there's even more that aren't in this room. The league, we're here for you, and we are available at all times for you, and we definitely want to be the resource that you can count on first and most. So with that, we'll start to try to deal with some questions now.
Most of our questions deal with how you can receive a copy of the PowerPoint slides. And again, if you would like to receive a copy of the PowerPoint slides, please send your request to Rose Hall at rhall@flcities.com. We'd also like to remind you that a copy of today's webinar presentation will be available on the League's website at www.floridaleagueofcities.com. We thank you for joining us. And I do see that we do have one other question that has come up. It regards Tabor There's a comment at this morning's meeting in Palm Beach County. Apparently, Senate President Herodopoulos confirmed the initial state first on TABAR. And the comment is with respect to that issue. And the caller is suggesting that that the league move on this issue cautiously. Would you like to discuss that a little bit more, Rebecca?
Thank you. Yes, Senator Herodopoulos, the Senate President, is beginning to talk to various groups about his plans and is confirming that what he told us privately a week or two ago, and that is his intent to begin with the state first with respect to TABOR, or the revenue cap issue. And does that affect how the league approaches this issue? Absolutely. It changes the strategy altogether. It's very hard to react, though, to a proposal when you don't have anything in front of you. And I think a lot of how cities approach this issue going forward will depend very much on what the bill looks like. The bill could apply to the state and have very little impact on city operations. The bill could apply to the state and it could have a lot of impact on city operations. And it really comes down to how the bill is drafted. We're going to be taking a hard look at the bill as soon as it's available for our view, and you can expect to be hearing from us about exactly what it does and how it may impact your operations in the future. Thank you.
The question also refers to Senator Herodopoulos was interested in knowing what the top 5 unfunded mandates were for particular cities, and we've had that same request made of the League of Cities, and our list includes police and fire pensions and the use of the insurance premium tax. That has cost cities over $400 million in the last 11 years to implement the changes that the state legislature made. That number is accessible, but it is very important, again, for you to let your local legislators know how that is directly affecting your particular municipality. The effective public notice mandate, which to the tune of over $10 million a year per city. Your city clerks typically have access to that type of information on a yearly basis. The subsidized insurance coverage for retirees, which any finance officer will be able to tell you how much they're having to book as your unfunded or your post-employment benefit costs. Your comp planning plan amendment and plan changes filings with the state and the costs associated with those activities. And the 5th one is eluding me now. Presumption. Oh, yes, the disability presumption, again, for police officers and firefighters, and this relates to their claims for workers' compensation and disability pension benefits. And that applies, again, to police officers, firefighters, and correctional officers, and it is another significant unfunded mandate. Okay.
All right, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us at today's webinar. We, again, encourage you to go to www.flcities.com or FloridaLeagueOfCities.com to get a copy of today's webinar, and we appreciate you participating in today's webinar. Again, we want to encourage you that it is important for all of you to get involved in the League's legislative issues, and we look forward to working with you this year. Thank you for joining us.